Welcome everyone to another XYZ workshop. This evening, we are very lucky to have Rico Walker, who is an associate environment artist at Naughty Dog. And Rico is going to talk us through a little bit of his sort of process when it comes to creating props and assets for games. So, Rico, I will hand it over to you and you can take it from there.
All right. So, um, I have been doing 3D art for quite a while now. I've actually been a 3D artist since around 2006, and I've been working professionally since then, different jobs. I mostly did like kind of government contract work in education field, and I recently became uh, an artist in the game industry. So that's kind of a little bit of my background. Um, so as far as props go, I want to say the very first and most important thing that you can do is research and reference. When I start any project, before I even look at photos or videos, I do a bunch of research first, just so I understand what it is that I'm trying to build and what it's capable of, what it can do, what its limitations are. So, what I like to do in this instance, today I'm going to be going over kind of my process for the free motion dual cable cross machine. This is my favorite piece of gym equipment that I see 5 days a week at my local gym. So, I chose this as a prop just because I wanted to find a personal project that I can do in a short period of time and that I can stay focused on and see it through the end. So it's one of those things where like I see this every day, so every day I go to the gym, it's a reminder that I need to finish this. So that's kind of why I chose this as a prop because it's something I know I can complete in a short amount of time. So with that in mind, what I like to do is kind of research the prop I'm making since I know the actual name of it. It's kind of easy to find. And the first thing you will notice when you look this up is there are many different variations of this machine. So it was kind of daunting to kind of start because I didn't know exactly what the actual model number was. So I couldn't look up the exact model of what I'm looking for. So what I did instead was I went to the manufacturer's website and I found a variation that's close enough. And luckily, they actually have dimensions and measurements on the official website. So that was super lucky there because you're not always going to get that. So this is what I like to use as a good starting point so I can kind of get my measurements in. And since they're in orthographic format already, this is a win-win because I can also use this in my viewport as reference along with my measurements. So I get something like this, and what I like to do is do a bunch of reference gathering in person. Of course, you're not going to be able to do this for every single prop because certain things may be like, you know, out of reach or you can't get to that location to gather it. But in my case, I had full access to this equipment, and I was able to gather as much reference as I want with this. So I took a lot of pictures and I kind of grouped everything into kind of different sections with what I need to represent. And the one thing I want to point out here is the labels. So that's the main thing I try to do is I try to get a front capture of all my labels because I know in the end process I'm gonna take those into Photoshop and I'm gonna make a quick texture out of that. So I try to get something that has flat enough lighting so I don't use a flash. And luckily the lighting in the gym is pretty much even enough to where I can take normal shots of this and get a pretty even lighting across this texture. So that actually works out. Now, that's not always going to be the case because there have been times where I've had to reference gather and I'm out in direct sunlight, and depending on the time of day, you may get hard shadows in your what you're trying to capture. So this was just kind of like a perfect scenario. You're not always going to get that. And I wanted to see with this project. So my main goal with this project was to make this prop and fit it onto one texture set. That was the entire goal and purpose of this project. So when I start a project, I always try to learn something new, or try to challenge myself to do something I haven't done yet. And in my previous works, I've had pieces of equipment or like for government work and everything, and they've had maybe 20 to 30 texture sets a piece, and they were more for like rendering in film and kind of presentation, well, stuff for that. But for this, I wanted to actually make an actual prop that can be used in a game engine and be optimized. So my goal was to figure out how to get all of this on one texture set. And I did not know how to do that going into this. This is one of those things where like experimentation is key. So at least I know what my goal was going into it. I have the reference I need. Um, I have measurements. So from there, I can go into Maya and actually start setting up my scene. In addition to pictures, what I actually recommend is if you have the ability to do this, to take video reference of what you're trying to build. This is really important just because pictures don't always show you everything that you need to see. And if you have video of everything kind of like in context and you move around the prop or equipment that you're trying to build, it's actually going to be a lot easier because you'll see how things connect, how things are formed. You can see the silhouette, how everything relates to each other. So a lot of perspective in here, so it's a really good idea to also take video along with photo, just because you'll get some minor details that you would have normally missed if you were just taking single shots of what you feel is important for you to see at the time. So the reference gathering is not like a one time thing for me. It's a continuous process. So over the course of, I want to say, a month, I kept gathering more reference as I needed, because I would get to a point where I was modeling. I was like, hey, I don't know what this looks like. I can't see the inside of this. I can't see the backside of this. How am I going to build this? So that's where the video comes into handy, so you can kind of give an overall reference. You can kind of see how things are put together in the crevices and everything. So, and also this machine kind of moves up and down, so you kind of see me here. I'm actually moving the equipment up and down just to see how I need to build it so it can be functional. So that's a another important tidbit is I like to build stuff to be functional. So I keep that in mind when I'm modeling how this equipment actually moves and operates. So it's that's something I feel is really important, just because if you're building stuff just to make it look good, but it's not actual functional, I don't think that's a good idea. Just because in the long run, you might need to use it for a different purpose. You might need to animate it, so it's good to figure out how things move and how things connect together. So moving on, going into Maya. So in my viewport, what I like to do, like I said, is I like to set up my reference, and this is the reference that I pull directly from the website. So I have the overall height of this, I have the depth and the width, and what I like to do is I like to use my layers, just because I started off as a 3ds Max guy, so layers are kind of embedded into me. So that's kind of why I have that here. I have a layer for like just the reference itself, and then I have a layer that's an actual the bounding box of my limits. So what I like to do for pretty much everything is always use real world measurements as much as possible. It's not always going to be 100%, but it you will have a much better time if you actually use your real world measurements, just because when you have to fit your stuff together and you're making multiple pieces that are different varying sizes, it will all fit together in the end versus, just kind of eyeing it and making it whatever size you think it should be. That's sometimes that's unavoidable, but if you have a overall cube or something that kind of shows you your limitations, your bounds of your prop that you're making, it's actually a good idea to kind of have that set up just so when you're building this, you know that you don't want to go outside of these bounds. And for this here, another thing I like to do is I don't have it on this ref board, but if I go to another ref board of my current equipment that I'm working on, so I'm also working on another piece of equipment here, and this one is a lot more organized. Yeah, so that's one thing I like to do now is try to organize my equipment on my board. This piece of equipment is like very, very large and a lot of details, so I had to organize everything. And you can kind of see on my ref board, I have everything labeled. And the main thing I want to point out is I actually took measurements. So I actually went to the equipment over several days to months, and I actually took measurements as needed for specific things that I needed to kind of build so that the overall measurements will be correct. So again, here I did my own reference gathering, uh, took measurements everywhere. So in here I have like the core of the equipment that I wanted to build. And again, I went to the website and wow, this website actually had the exact dimensions of everything. So I was able to kind of pull this together and I put together this on my ref board so I can have, a clear, concise overall measurements for everything. And this is actually very helpful for when you start putting everything together. So measurements are really good to have if you can get them. So moving back into Maya, um, since I know I wanted to put this on one texture set, uh, I did a little planning on how I was going to be able to accomplish that. And I know that I wanted to make a lot of geometry that just stacked on top of each other as far as the UVs go. So going into my model, I'm going to go into just kind of how I started to model this a little bit. So if I go into another scene, so again in my folder structure here, I kind of have the project set up to how I want it to be, and I have multiple iterations of the file. And if you're a Maya user, you know that you need to have multiple iterations just because Maya will crash on you or you'll lose work. So having multiple iterations that you can kind of go back and forth between and alongside autosaves is a very good idea just because you mess something up, you don't realize it until like you get too far along and then you have to go back and pull some geometry or something from a previous file. So it's always good to have iterations just in case. So here's a slot where I know that I need to make a lot of booleans. And the way I wanted to do this, let me show you. If I go back to my ref board and I load up the right one. So in here, um, I was making this part here, and I know I needed to kind of make these equidistant, and they need to be the whole need to be around the same size. So I kind of set up an array, and I had a pivot point kind of like in the center here. So you can see I have a locator here where I kind of just did a rotation, and I made the points along the where I wanted the boolean the holes at, and this kind of goes along just on a plane. And I just pretty much made a plane and gave it some geometry, some extra segments in here, just so I have enough detail so when I boolean this in, I can actually connect the points. And what I like to do is kind of have the center of my boolean have a line go through it. I found that that's a lot easier from when you actually subtract it from the geometry just to have a line on each side, just so that you know where it stops for your segments, and then a line in the center point so you can branch out from there. And going forward a little bit, go into the next file where I show the completed version of this. So this is the completed model, and this is kind of what I was talking about, where you have a center line that's going through all of the points here, and you have a terminating line that you can terminate your extra edges. Um, so you can kind of see the actual topology. It looks messy, but it works. So if I were to kind of turn off edge faces and I kind of rotate around this, it looks clean. You can't see any kind of warping or bending on the actual surface itself, and that's mostly due to this being a planar surface. It's going to be different depending on if you're on a curved surface or not. But for this, I made just a whole bunch of terminating edges that they kind of terminate at a certain point, so they don't need to go beyond that point. And again, I started to do the same thing here for this piece down here, where I have the different pieces that I boolean. So what I do is like I make all the pieces I need to boolean, and then what I like to do is combine them all into one shape first, delete history, and then I subtract it from the piece that I want. I don't actually do them individually, just because I'm using the older version of Maya where they didn't add the pro boolean in there, and it just works a lot better if your boolean, your subtraction shape is all one piece versus multiple pieces. I just found that to be like an easier workflow for me, so that saves you a little bit of trouble in the end for cleanup anyway. Next up, I want to point out some rotation values that I set up. Um, this is kind of goes back to what I say. You want to make sure your model is functional. So what I did was I actually put some rotation values here in the scene, just so I know um, what I can go back to and what they were just before I set them up. So these were set up when I made the shapes, the holes for when I needed to boolean them out. This is like the distance in between the rotation values. So to kind of demonstrate that, I just want to show you this here. So if I were to take this arm here, I know that this kind of swivels left and right. And inside of here, there's a little pin that locks it into place. So I'll select that as well. I'm just gonna hide everything there. And I'm gonna go into my rotation value for this. And I believe it was 12.5. So I'll just put that in there. And what you'll notice that when I start to rotate this, it locks into place. You see that it's a perfect distance from between each point. So that's good to have for animation reference. So it's good to have that value just kind of stored away somewhere. So when you go back to rig it or animate it, you'll have that perfect value to where this kind of swivels in place. So that's one value there. And you can kind of see I have a locator in place here just so that I can actually see where I connect everything to. So that's something for later. And going into the other way, so this one actually rotates up and down. And this rotation value is 13.63. So if I just plug that in, and we'll just take a look at it from this angle, you can see that it's aligning perfectly at each point. And this is one of the things where I need to match this almost exactly to the reference, just because I know that at a certain angle, this is going to be completely straight across. So I had to make sure this point right here was actually a middle point to where this boom for this arm is actually extending out fully horizontal, at a just at a 90-degree angle, pretty much. So that's the kind of purpose for all of that. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of the modeling process, just a little bit. So what I started doing recently is just capturing time lapses of me working. And the reason for that is just because it's kind of cool to show people that. And it actually helps me as an artist to kind of go back and see how I did things and how I can improve. So it's actually beneficial for you, especially if you're working on a long project and you stop for a certain amount of time and you want to pick it back up. It's kind of hard to remember the last thing you did or why you were doing that. So if you have something like a time lapse video kind of showing the last thing you did, it's really easy to pick back up. So that's another reason for that. And in here, I'm just kind of showing you working in sections and kind of like quads. What I like to do is uh, I break the model into like four different quadrants, and I only work on one quadrant at a time, and then I mirror it over. So just to kind of save time, because I know like this plate, this weight plate here, it's going to be symmetrical on at least two sides. So it's easier to kind of go in and just work on different quadrants at a time. And this piece right here, if I go and look here, this is going to be this centerpiece here where the pin for the weights go in. They go through the entire weight and they lock into here. And this whole piece travels up and down. And what I like to do for that is since I know this is in sections, so if I were to zoom into this a little bit and just kind of show you, um, that's one section, but I really only need to do one quadrant of this section. So that's what I mean about working in quads. I only need to do 25% of this model and just mirror it to the other side. And the same thing, it's pretty much the exact same thing on the opposite side. So this way you can kind of work a little smarter. So you only have to do one section of this, and then once you're done, and that's kind of mirrored over, then you have a whole chunk that you can now uh, make an array and duplicate it, and then bridge it all together. So that's an easier way to kind of work and do something that's, it's pretty much the same repeated over and over again. So it's good to kind of get a point where you know the main function of everything you're making, and then you make just a quadrant of it. So again, kind of going to my time lapse, you kind of see I make one quadrant, I mirror it over again, then I have the whole thing, and then I kind of go into an array, and then it stacks. And that's pretty much this here. So that's part of the modeling, and just kind of going to the unwrap section. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. So my UV unwrap layout, I didn't know how I was gonna do this going into this because this was like the major point that I wanted to learn myself. So I had to do a lot of experimentation. So I just want to go into one of my files and just kind of show you what I did. So I know going into this that I want to stack as much of my UVs as possible. So I intentionally only modeled half of everything that I knew was going to be mirrored and stacked. So for the weight plates here, they're all mirrored geometry, well, instance geometry. So if I go and kind of look at this on my UVs, you kind of see here, they're spread out a little bit, but if I were to kind of click on multiple of these, you can kind of see from I have my UVs on shaded mode. So it's this little stair here. And it'll show you what's stacked and what's not. So as I click on more of these, uh, it gets more and more blue. And that shows me that I have these UVs stacked. And that's kind of what I wanted to do to kind of save uh, space on a texture set. So the overall texture set, if I were to select everything, it looks like this. And you can see what's stacked and what's not. So once I get a good flow of what's stacked and what's not, then I can kind of go and kind of play with texel density. And for that, what I like to do is use a quick shader that kind of visualizes texel density. So I actually have one set up for UV checking, and pretty much it's gonna be this little checkered pattern. So if I were to go in here and kind of zoom in, I can actually see in relation to the rest of the model how dense certain pieces are. And this is kind of good to kind of visually indicate um, your textile density for certain pieces versus other things. Because the overall body of this, let me turn this off so you can actually see it. The overall body of this, it didn't need to be too dense just because it's a larger piece. But if you want something like that, there's actually a site I recommend. If you look up UV checker, dot vinzxyz, it'll take you to this little procedural UV checker map maker. It's free, and you can kind of go in here and change a lot of parameters um, for how you want to display the pattern across your UVs. So this is super useful. Change your colors in here. You can change the size of the texture set that you download. And there's a lot of different features for like the text and everything. So once you're pretty much got something you like, you can just hit download. Let's say I'll just do a 2K texture, and it'll just kind of download that texture, and you'll just have that texture, and you can put it in your directory and put it across some material, and that will be useful for using on your shader. So with that in mind, this was not a one and done thing. This was a constant back and forth, fixing my UVs and laying them out. I say the layout took more time than anything, but actually unwrapping the UVs was easy. Um, and the main thing I like to do when I do my UV unwrap is I want to make the majority of my UV islands as straight as possible. So for example, if I look at this body piece here, um, on the edge that's going across the top, it's completely horizontal. It is flat. Same thing with the one on the side and the bottom. But on the side where there's a curve, I left it alone. And the reason I'm doing that is just because the more planar and straight your UVs are, the tighter you can pack them together. So that's gonna help your layout overall and help you maintain textile density across certain objects that you want. Now, of course, for objects that are more spherical, that's not always possible, and that's fine. You just want your major pieces to be as straight as possible, just so that you can stack them and kind of build them together and save on texture space. So that's kind of the way I do that. Um, and then going off into what I like to do is I use Substance Painter for my texture painting. And in Substance Painter, I don't know if you noticed, but inside of the Baker, there's an option for your high poly and your low poly, and it actually uses a suffix underscore low underscore high. So what I like to do is go through my model and I apply the underscore low suffix to my low poly. And I just want to show you how I go about doing that. So I have my model kind of separated on my outliner between low poly and high poly, and you can kind of see everything is also named, which I highly recommend you do. Name all your objects. Even if you don't know what it's called, make up a name. Anything is better than piece, cylinder, whatever number. Just so that when you go into Substance Painter, and you want to use something like, geometry mask, and you want to mask off certain objects, or you want to isolate certain objects, it's actually helpful if you actually know the name of what you're trying to select from a list. So it's just easier overall for you as an artist to visually see the name of an object, and also for your coworkers. Because if you're working in a team, you might not be the only one that has to open this file. And it's just a courtesy to have your things labeled and named properly. Um, your coworkers will thank you for that. So, how did I do the naming convention for this? Um, let's just make a bunch of cubes really quick, and I will show you kind of what I do. So I'm just gonna close my UV editor right fast. All right. So I'm just gonna make a bunch of boxes, and we'll just kind of see this on outliner. So I have PQ 1 through 4. So if I wanted to add a underscore low suffix to this, all of this all at once, what I would do is go into modify and go into search and replace names. And in here, you can put search for, and if you put a dollar sign in here, it's going to take what you have selected, and then in the next input box, you can put what you want the suffix to be. So in this case, it's going to be underscore low. So if I hit apply and I look back on the outliner, it has applied underscore low to the suffix on the end of the object name. So this is super important because that's not something that's widely known. There's something I actually had to look up myself when I was working on this project. I was like, this got to be a easier way to do this, because like I know in 3ds Max they actually have a breakdown that has like prefix, suffix, all of that, and they have everything in one dialog that you can do that. But Maya doesn't have that, but it can still do it if you use a dollar sign. So that's useful. So now that I have, my underscore low in here, now I have that set up for my high poly. I mean my low poly. And what I like to do is do all my UVs, and then I make the high poly just in case I need to change some things around. I just like to do my UVs first and then the high poly. I found that to be just a little bit easier for me on in the case of my workflow as well. Um, so in here, if I go into my outliner, you can kind of see everything is underscore high. So I pretty much did the same thing I showed with this. So if I select all these boxes and I want to change this suffix to underscore high, only thing I have to do is go back into modify and search and replace names again. And now since it actually has the correct name, I can put underscore low here, and then I can tell it to replace with underscore high, apply it, and then you can see I have underscore high now. So now I have the suffix for my low poly and my high poly, and this will be essential for when you go into um, Substance Painter and have to use the Baker. So again, um, let me load up another scene really quick. So if I go into, I believe, okay, so this is more of the finished product here as far as the modeling goes. Now I have both sides kind of mirrored out, and all the geometry is actually there. So I just want to kind of show you what I mean by this with the UVs being stacked. So if I were to select all of this and just kind of make this a little bit bigger, you can see that I have a lot of red on my UV layout. If I have the shader on, it kind of tells me what's stacked, what's overlapping is basically what it's showing you. So all of these UVs have been mirrored over from the other side. So you can kind of see here on this, you just close this to make this a little bigger. So everything that's red is actually mirrored over. So that's how I am saving space on a UV layout, just by stacking them. And same thing with the weight plates. You can see that this entire side is pretty much just all red. But you can see that the face plate that's actually on the weights, they're unique. And the reason for that is I want to make the numbers on the weights. So these have to be unique. So that is why that these are not actually stacked, because that just wouldn't work for what I'm trying to do. I needed those to be exactly unique. So I took the geometry just off the front face of this and made that unique geometry, and then the rest of the weight that's stacked on the UVs. So this is going to allow me to individually number these, and I won't have any issues with the UVs being like overlapping with the numbers, because then it will get kind of weird. So once I have all of that and I'm satisfied, I generally go and make my high poly. I can do it in Maya. Sometimes I do it in Max. Sometimes I do it in ZBrush. It really depends on how I want to do it. In this case, I actually switched over to 3ds Max, and what I did was I just pretty much imported my low poly. So I'm just gonna go into my directory and just kind of pull this out. So if I import this in, there's my low poly, and I'll just turn off materials. Okay, let me load in a different one because this one is kind of, yeah. All right. So I have my model in here, and basically what I like to do is I'll just kind of select all the geometry, and I can kind of see that it's still the medium poly that I had from Maya. And basically the reason I'm just using Max to do the high poly is because I can go in here and drop a turbo smooth on it and tell it to respect smooth groups, so it'll respect my hard edges automatically, and then I can just kind of crank this number up how I want, and it'll just respect my edges a lot more. And it's pretty much as a one-click solution for me, and it does exactly what I need. So that's kind of the reason I do it in here versus doing it in Maya, just because um, it doesn't work exactly the same way that I actually need it to work. So that's the only reason for me going back to Max, just to do this one step. But it's one click, and once I get it, I export it out, and now I have my low poly and my high poly. And now I go into the fun section, which is texturing. So before I go into Substance Painter, what I like to do is make all my labels. And what do I mean by that? All of these little stickers here that are on the machine, like the caution and the warning, I like to go build these out first. I actually do this as I'm modeling, and the reason for that is I know that I'm going to be using these labels as a stamp inside of Substance Painter. So what I like to do is get the exact dimensions of these and actually use that to build the actual geometry on the model. So in this case, it's going to be this label here is the one in question here. So how I would go about doing this, if I go into Photoshop, I would go find the actual label itself, say here, and drag this into Photoshop. And what I want to do is I want to turn this into a texture that I can use as a stamp. Now, I can't just stamp it like this just because the ratio is off and there's a lot of extra information that I just straight up don't need. So what I like to do is use perspective crop tool. You can find this if you go into um, your edit toolbar. It depends on which workspace you have applied as well. Um, so I use Essentials, and it'll be kind of at the bottom over here in this kind of tier. So depending on what version of Photoshop, this might be a little bit different for you, but you can always go into Edit Toolbar and you can kind of drag in the tools that you want. And for me, I just wanted the Perspective Crop tool. So once you have that, activate that tool, and this will allow you to draw a box around your selection and actually move the actual points so that it actually fits around what you want to crop. So this is super helpful for if you get things that are at a weird angle. You can kind of use this crop tool to kind of build the perspective of it, just kind of trace around the edges, and then voila, now you have your label. And what I like to do is just kind of go in here with the paintbrush and just kind of go around the edges to kind of make them just kind of the same color as the edge that's going off. So it kind of you have some bleed distance for when you stamp this texture. So it's always a good idea to have that. So I just go in here and just kind of paint the edges around here really quickly. So I know it's a little bit sloppy, so I went over the edge here, but just for presentation purposes, this is how I would do it. And from here, what I like to do is go into image size, and I want to use these dimensions that I just got from this crop and put them right into Maya. So let's say this one for the height, I go into Maya and let's just make a new plane here. So I'll just go into my front view. I'll draw out a plane and I know the height. I'm just going to paste that value right in there. I'm not worried about the overall size because I can change that later. The most important thing is the dimensions themselves. So I'll copy that one, go back into Maya, paste that in. So now I know that label, when I stamp it, it'll be 1-to-1 as far as those dimensions go. So now what I can do is kind of bring that label back down to a normal size and just kind of place it where I need it to go. And that's pretty much the workflow for labels in general, just so that I know when I stamp it on in Substance Painter, it'll be correct. It'll be 1-to-1. So the main reason I do this is because if I do it the other way, where I make the label whatever dimensions I think it should be, and then I make the texture a completely different dimension, there's going to be a mishap when you go and stamp it. If they don't align, it's going to be like one edge is going to be taller than the other, and it may not be a 1-to-1 representation. So that is the reason why I pull the dimensions directly off the texture that I'm actually making. So when I stamp it, it's less work. It's less back and forth. So that's something that I kind of learned over time through trial and error. Um, just because I had to redo labels a lot, just because the dimensions were off. So I found going this method is a sure way of like eliminating that whole back and forth process of having to guess the dimensions. So once you have that, then I actually make the actual label. So now what I do is I'll unlock this layer and I'll just make a bottom layer and I will crop this to a 1-to-1 square ratio. So I'll just kind of go in here, holding Alt, and just kind of pull that back. So now it's a square ratio. Because as many of you know, Substance Painter, you can do like rectangular textures as a stamp, but it doesn't like that. So most programs don't like that. So what I like to do is just make all the textures I need to be just a square ratio, just because this universally works with everything. And now this will be my albedo texture for when I stamp. And then if I also go in here, I want to make a mask as well. So I'll save this out as one texture, and then I'll go into here and completely fill this with white. So this will be my alpha mask. So when I go into Painter, I have the albedo for the label and I have the mask for the label, the alpha channel. So when I stamp it, it'll actually crop the negative section out when you paste it. So it's great for certain things like this where you have, curved edges around like this, and you only want what's visible in the white area. If you have everything else black as a mask, it'll cut that out when you use it as a stamping painter. So that's the reason for that. And you can kind of see in here, I'm using Adobe Bridge just because it's easy to view all my PSD files. I kind of make everything a PSD file just so I have flexibility. It's a non-destructive workflow because if I need to make changes to certain textures, if I have it as a PSD, I can go and make changes and adjustments and save it, and then update it automatically inside of Painter, just using the update resources function. Um, so one last thing I want to show is this texture here. I know I wanted to use this as a stamp, and the way I went about doing that is a little bit tricky, just because the sample that I built it from was this. So I used this, and you kind of see like it's very glossy. You can kind of see my reflection in this. So how would you go about building this into a texture that you can use as a stamp? Um, so easy way to do that, if I were to pull this in. So I'm just gonna use the bigger one just as an example. What I actually did was I used the bigger picture that was sectioned off, and then I just kind of splintered them together. But for this purpose, I want to crop this, so I'll change my crop tool to uh, resolution so I can control everything. So now that I have that, now we see it's very glossy. I have the reflection in there, and that's not gonna go over well for a stamp. So I'm just gonna unlock that layer. And what I like to do is use the levels. So if I bring the levels up a little bit, you kind of see like I'm trying to push this to black and white as much as possible so that it kind of evens out the color. And usually what I have to do is I have to put, two layers of levels in here to actually achieve what I want it to do. So once you kind of, get something that you want in here, and then I'll drop in a saturation and I'll just desaturate the whole thing. Whoops. Desaturate. And then from here, you can kind of see I'm getting to where I need to be. And now for the actual stamp, I need it to be inverted. So I'm just going to drop a invert in there. And that's mainly how you would get around and get and do that. So I can play with the levels here again, just to kind of get more contrast and get it kind of darker. And that's how I went about making this texture here. So this would be like the end result of that. And now I can use that as a stamp inside of Painter. So moving on to Painter, which is the last step. So I just want to show you this is everything, and it's all on one texture set. And to kind of illustrate this, I kind of put some channels in here, just like RGB, just to kind of show you what's going on in here. So if I were to go into this mask here, I just have a fill layer with the mask. If I were to go in here, just kind of paint down the center of this, you kind of see um, that's unique. It's not being mirrored. But if I were to go to the side, paint here, all of that's mirrored. All of this is mirrored. Same thing here. And now if I go into this section here, paint some blue here, and I look on the other side, it's not really mirrored because it's on the opposite side. So the reason for that is I had to flip the UVs in a way that the actual label, the free motion label, would actually come up properly on the flip UVs. So this is, like I said, it's trial and error. It's not like a one take and you win this. So another cool thing that I recently found out about Substance Painter is that like when you're going around your model and you're kind of looking at the bottom and the top, the lighting just doesn't go to where you need it no matter how you rotate the environment. So a quick little trick you can do um, is if you go into the display settings under environment alignment, if you change whirl to camera, and now you rotate the lighting. Now I can rotate the lighting so that I can actually see the bottom of this. So it's actually easier to kind of paint on. And now that I have it on camera, it's actually going to follow the camera. And no matter where I look, you're actually going to have the model lit everywhere. That's something I found out like really recently, and I wish I knew that a long time ago. So just sharing it with you just in case you didn't know, because that's super helpful. So again, just kind of going in here, and I want to show you kind of what's mirrored, what's not. So if I were to go and look at the weight stack here, and I just paint on just one of these, you can see it paints on all of them going down the line, and then on the opposite side, so you can see that's mirrored. And same thing with this side, paint green there. That's all mirrored. So this is the actual stacking working really well. And again, this is the reason why the face plates, I need those to be individually unwrapped just because they were unique for stamping the textures on them. Because all of the numbers had to be unique. So that geometry cannot be stacked. But it can be mirrored. So in this case, um, it's mirrored on both sides. So if I just kind of cover up that 5 there, you can kind of see it's covered up the 5 there. So in this case, these two are stacked, but the rest of them are independent. So they all have a pair pretty much. And there's a lot of stuff that I could go into with texturing, but we don't have time for that. So overall, my texturing, I start from a base layer. So if I just want to show you this really quick. So another thing, please, everybody, name your layers. Your coworkers will thank you for that. Just nothing's worse than getting a file from somebody and nothing in here is named, and you have to fix it, and you have no idea what's what, and you have to waste time going through all of this, turning things on and off. So I recommend just labeling everything. Just make it simple. It doesn't have to be complex, but just naming your layers is very user friendly for everyone involved. Even for you, if you have to come back to the file, and most of the time you're not going to remember what you named something or what something was called at the time you're working on it. It's a good idea to just name your layers, just for your purposes as well, and anybody else who has to open this file. So once I get, the textures kind of to a point where I feel it's necessary, for this, I didn't want to go into too much detail, but you can kind of see if I turn on, let me turn off these paint layers here. If I turn on my base color, you can see here my roughness. I think the roughness is probably the most important map as far as getting realism, just because of the variations that it causes throughout the model. So I spent a lot of time on just the roughness map alone. And again, my metallic map. So those are pretty solid colors. You should most of the time it's going to be straight white or black, and then sometimes there's some gray values just because it kind of bumps it up a little bit. And then I have my normals. I only have really one thing on my opacity, which was this giant label here, because this sticker I needed it to be kind of like glossy just on the sticker part and not anywhere else. So it had to be its own geometry and a stamp. So that's why that's pretty much the only thing there. Of course, the AO pass. I do two different AO passes when I do this. I usually do a one where it's even AO across the entire thing where it just casts shadows everywhere. But you can't really do that if you're going to animate it. So I do another ambient occlusion pass to where it's limited by the object only. And that is something that you would probably want to do if you know this object is going to be movable. You don't want to do like a flat AO that casts shadows, because what's going to happen is if you move this around, there's going to be a hard shadow in place of where you just moved it from. So you don't want that. So it really depends on if it's just going to be a static mesh or if it's going to be animated, whether you want to do that or not. And one last thing I just wanted to touch on was the baker. So I'm going to load this up, and just kind of go back to what I was saying. The underscore low and underscore high suffix, that's the reason why I set the model up that way. Just so when you load it in the substance painter, and you have your low poly base, you can load in your high poly and you can actually use matching by name. So everything will match by name. So your bake will come out a lot better that way if you use that. So that's the importance of the underscore low, underscore high, just in case you didn't know that. Um, and then of course the mesh itself, playing around with the frontal distance. Of course, you're gonna want to play with this just to kind of get your cage. So if I turn on my cage, you kind of see you want to play with the distance of the cage, and where it's red, that's where you're having a mismatch, an error. So it's kind of a good visual indicator of where your errors are, so you can know what your distance, your cage distance is.
Cool.
And that's pretty much it. And the last thing, of course, is going to be your export textures. And this is going to greatly differ depending on your project and your output game engine. So in my case, I wanted to show this on Sketchfab. So I used the Sketchfab template just to kind of put my textures in a certain way. But of course, you can go in here and use, the Unreal or just the standard PBR workflow. So it really depends on what your output is, because I changed this based on the project needs. So uh, I know
Hmm.
what Naughty Dog would use target files, but in my case, I use PNGs because I didn't need it to be that intensive as far as memory. So I wanted to just kind of limit that. And sometimes I even use JPEGs. It just depends on what I'm going for in the end. But that's pretty much my overall workflow for props.
That was amazing, Rico. Lots of really cool insight and knowledge shared. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through that. Some very useful tips, particularly around sort of stamp creation and texturing. We have a few questions if you've got time to answer them.
Yeah, sure.
So first question is from me. Excuse me. What made you get into hard surface modeling? Where did that come from?
Okay, that's a funny story because I actually started off. I did not like hard surface modeling because I was not good at it. I was terrible at it, and I started off as a character artist.
No
That's
way.
something that I wanted to do like since I was little. I used to draw just characters every day growing up, and then when I got to like college level, like my focus kind of shifted. But I actually made a lot of 3D characters, and then the reason I switched to hard surface modeling is because all of the jobs I was getting, that was the main function of those jobs. I was straight up hard surface modeling. So for I want to say like the last 12 years, that's mainly what I've been doing at every single job is hard surface modeling. So I kind of got pushed into that direction, and then I
Hmm.
got really good at it. So then it was just like, you know what? I like this now.
Interesting. Okay. It's cool because I know a few other people who are transitioning. I think of Helena here in the server who, like, for a long time was working in character art and now is moving more into like tech art. It's kind of cool to see people kind of find their thing as things sort of work out for them. So that's really cool. Um, your props. So second question is also for me. How long do you typically spend on a prop? So obviously, like I've seen a lot of your work on ArtStation and Twitter, and it looks incredible. What's your typical sort of turnaround time for an asset, sort of like what you've got in front of you?
That's a good question. And that's kind of why I started doing time lapses and actually recording my sessions just so I can actually tell you an actual
Mhm,
number. So if I go back into my projects and I just kind of look at just my dates, pretty
mhm,
much. So I started this, let's say on 11/15, and I kind of finished this. This will be like my last one, maybe on 2/6. So I spent, a good amount of time on this, but this was like kind of as I go. It wasn't because this is a personal project. I
yeah,
didn't work on this like, the entire time.
mhm,
So I would say I spent a good month like just dedicated to just this one model
yeah,
over time.
yeah,
But on larger pieces of equipment that I worked on a job, let's say if I were to kind of look at my art station and just kind of look at like something massive like this pump rack module.
Mhm.
Um, this took about 4 months
Alright.
with two artists. So it was me and another artist. It was a lot of geometry. Something like this took about 4 months to fully complete from start to finish, and that goes for texturing. Modeling, texturing, UVs, and all that stuff.
Yep.
Even the render time as well.
Yeah,
So it
because
really
it's a
depends on the size of the prop.
yeah.
Uh, but then this right here is not, it wasn't as bad. But if I were to go and look at something like this, I did this in 2 months and just by myself
Mhm.
because uh, at the time I had like a really short deadline for this, so I was under crunch. So those are not realistic values in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
But I actually got this entire thing done in 2 months flat.
Damn. Looks
Um,
incredible, man. It's
I
super
don't know
cool.
how that was possible, but like I said, I was under crunch.
Yeah.
So, and I had like I had tunnel vision when I was making this. So I just I just put my head down and I kept working until it was done, pretty much. But yeah, it really depends on the time constraint. Um that's how long it takes me to do something. But usually if I have a clear, concise goal, that's the only thing I'm working on. I can get it pretty much turned down in like a month or two for
Cool.
like a high poly prop like this.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Got one more for me. So, obviously, you use Maya a lot.
Yes.
Do you you mentioned Max as well. Do you have, like, other tools in your pipeline? So, I think Daniel later on asks as well, like, so does ZBrush come into your high poly workflow, or do you just prefer to work in sort of Maya Max?
It used to.
Yeah.
When I was doing character art, I heavily used ZBrush, like a lot, a lot. But um, my workflow for hard surface modeling, because I go with a medium poly workflow,
Mhm.
most of the time you don't even need a high poly to build off of. You can just use the low poly, and you can do some tricks inside of Substance Painter that gives you like the curved edges around models
Mhm.
using a curvature map, and you can actually fake the blend in between it and actually the surface. So there's ways that you can fake that without having to do it.
Okay. Okay, cool. Um, Next question is in relation to textile density. So it's from Peter. So you mentioned obviously your UV process. Do
Yes.
you set yourself a textile density minimum, or like do you have a target TD in mind before you sort of go into your UV process?
No, I don't
Mm,
have a target in mind. Because it's mainly because of the project needs that I've had in the past. As far as props go, I know that this one here, I wanted to kind of make it visually pleasing from a distance. I didn't have an exact textile density. I didn't even look at that the entire time that I was doing this. But
mhm,
I know in a studio like Naughty Dog, we have a minimum of 512 per pixel meter.
mhm,
That's kind of the standard for Naughty Dog, and it's going to differ from studio to studio. And that's kind of where you would come into having multiple texture sets so that you can maintain that textual density. But
mhm.
in this case, I just specifically wanted one texture set to rule them all. So I just made it fit.
Cool. Makes sense. Makes sense. Another software question. I think this might be one of the last ones. So, obviously, you demonstrated Substance Painter for your baking process. Do you ever use Marmoset or any other tools for baking?
Yes, 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 yes. Okay.
Hmm.
So in the past, even on the last job I had, I predominantly used Marmoset Toolbag to bake all of my textures, my initial maps. So if I go back into, let me see, I believe I have it on one of these models, but it was probably this one. But yeah, I use Marmoset Toolbag to kind of bake everything for all the details. Yep, there it is. So what I would do is I would do like an exploded model that I would
Mhm.
import, and then I would have like the low and then the high poly on it, and then I would bake it this way, just in the individual parts, because I got around the thing where, like, you have the back faces kind of interpenetrating and it's making shadows. So
Mhm.
that's kind of how I got around that.
Mhm.
That's just one way of doing it. Of course, like when you have the underscore low underscore high thing, that's another way of kind of occluding that and getting around it. So I have used multiple software just to do the same exact thing, but I predominantly use Marmoset Toolbag up until the point, Substance Painter got to a point where like they had that, the Baker got so much better
Yeah.
that I just switched to Painter entirely.
Yeah. That makes sense. Makes sense. Daniel's questions about ZBrush. We think we've covered that one already. Helena has a question. So Helena is the person I mentioned who transitioned from character art to tech art. So Helena's question is: as a fellow artist who left character art behind, what what made you switch? What was the motivation or the drive? Was it just because that was the work you were getting, or was there other reasons?
So it was partially mostly the work that I was getting, but then I don't know, something clicked in me like when I start to go and actually reference gather certain things. It's kind of affecting me on a different level now, to where I have like, the cliche artist brain to where I can't turn it off. So no matter where I go, I'm always looking at hard surface details and how I would do it. And that's something that I never really got when I was doing just character work. Because that would be kind of weird, right? Just staring at people. So like I didn't
Yeah.
really get that same kind of thing. But with hard surface, I it's just the little details that kind of excite me.
Hmm.
Just kind of like when you zoom in and you kind of see like little grooves on just a screw head or a bolt. Just certain things like that. For me, that stuff actually excites me, and I love seeing like complex hard surface details and how I would uh, replicate that in 3D. Just I like the
Hmm.
challenge of it. The challenge of it is why I switched.
Cool. That makes sense. Okay, final question, Rico, from Steve. How did you tackle baking the ambient occlusion maps for the weights, looking at the tiling elements for this?
So for that, I kind of did hit on that, but I'll just kind of go back into Substance Painter. So on the Baker for ambient occlusion, you have this option here for self occlusion that says only same.
Hmm.
Um, that's how you kind of negate the shadows being overcast around the entire thing. So if you put it on always, it's shadows across everything that's being occluded by other objects. So it's gonna be put shadows where you don't want them. But if you do only same mesh name, it won't do that. So that's kind of like the two-step process I do. So I make both ambient occlusion maps. So I make one, export it out, bring it back in, make another, keep that, and I use it on specific parts of the model in my workflow.
Cool. Awesome. I think that's everything. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us this afternoon, Rico. Lots of really cool insight and knowledge, and thank you everyone for turning up this evening. We had a lovely crowd again, once again, for another workshop. That's going to be our last workshop for a little while. There will be other activities coming up on the community. Alex is looking into them, and mods and I are mods will meet and go through kind of options and stuff. But workshops will be sort of quieting down for a few months now. But we hope to bring them back again then in sort of September, October. So we're finishing strong with Rico. So once again, Rico, just thank you very, very much. I really appreciate that, dude. That was awesome.